We're going to continue our discussion of stems and roots by talking about herbaceous. There are two kinds of herbaceous stems. There are herbaceous dicots, which means their seed leaves have two leaves, and herbaceous monocots. And there's subtle differences in the internal structure of the herbaceous. And herbaceous is distinguished from, just so you know, herbaceous is distinguished from the idea of a woody stem. A herbaceous stem does not have wood. So one difference is the vascular bundles are grouped in a ring, as shown here. Each of these is a vascular bundle containing the xylem and phloem, and they're in a ring around a central aspect of the stem. The tissue with which these bundles are embedded is called the cortex, and then the outer layer again is called the epidermis, and really functions pretty much the same way that the epidermis of the woody stems function, and it protects everything inside. Now, a monocot, now remember the previous picture, now look at the monocot. The monocot has a much different arrangement, and the monocot stem has a rind on the outside that covers the stem, and then the vascular bundles are in a ring around the outside as well as scattered throughout the stem. In that rind is a material known as silica. Silica is like sand, and the purpose of silica is to make the rind stronger. So we move on and look at vegetative reproduction and special stems. Vegetative reproduction is the producing of a new plant from something other than the seed. So it's a producing of a new plant from the stem, the leaf, or the root. The process of vegetative propagation is using vegetative reproduction to start new plants, and this is commonly done in various areas of horticulture. And there are a lot of different forms of vegetative propagation. One is called a cutting. A cutting is just taking a piece of a root or a stem and planting it and having it become a new plant. Layering is the coaxing, is setting up a node. Remember from our previous discussion what the node was. Setting up a node and allowing it to produce roots and then transplanting it. Grafting, I think most of us have heard of grafting. Grafting is the transplantation of plant tissue from one plant to the other. And if you plant a bud, then it's called budding. It's the same idea as grafting, but you take a bud off the stem of one plant and you put it on a different plant. And then the last of these five is called tissue culturing. And tissue culturing is the most interesting because what you do is take single plant cells or small, very small portions of plant tissue, and you grow that up into full-fledged plant tissues. So these diagrams will look at the various types of vegetative propagation. This is the cutting, and essentially what you see here is the cutting off of a stem with leaves and just planting it and then having it produce its own roots and its own plant. This is layering. Here we're coaxing, we're taking a bud and a node right here and we're putting dirt around it, and we're essentially getting this to produce roots. Once the roots are produced, then you cut it off and plant it. This is straightforward grafting, where you take the portion of one plant and stick it into or onto a second plant and wrap it up, and then they merge and become a single plant with the plant growing. And then this is if this transplanted part is a bud off another stem, you put it on this stem, wrap it up, and the next thing you know, you have a new stem that's incorporated into that plant. So we have cutting, layering, grafting, and budding. And the only one I don't have a diagram for is the tissue culturing. Now let's talk for a minute about tropism and how plants respond to stimulus. Tropism is the $50 word for a response to a stimulus, and the stimulus can take several forms. If the stimulus is light, then the tropism is called phototropism. If the stimulus is gravity, then it's called geotropism. If the stimulus is a chemical, it's called chemotropism. If the stimulation is water, it's hydrotropism. And then lastly, if the stimulus is touch, it's thigmotropism. And let's look at some examples of these various tropisms. So this is an example of thigmotropism. And what happens is as this vine grows up, the stems go out, and when they touch a solid object like here and here and here, they wrap themselves around it. And that's thigmotropism. So that's a response to the touch of this fence, and that's why, and that acts to support this plant. This is an example of hydrotropism. This is a water pipe, a little hydrant here to show you that it's water, and the plant senses the water and then grows roots toward the water and showing hydrotropism. This is an example of geotropism. The plant's knocked over and it alters the axis of gravity, and the root begins to grow toward the gravity down instead of this way, and the stem begins to grow up instead of straight out this way. So this is an example of geotropism. And then lastly, this is phototropism. The light is coming in through the window. The plant is growing toward the light. And the only one I don't have an example of is the chemotropism. Now, all of this is controlled by plant hormones. And so this next slide, we'll go through the plant hormones. And plant hormones are the same as human hormones in the fact that they're chemicals that in very small amounts cause significant metabolic changes in the plant. The first of these is called auxin. Auxins are growth hormones, and when they are secreted by the roots, or shoots, and the secretion of these can lead to, like water can initiate the secretion of auxins, and they then cause the growth toward the water. A second one is called a cytokine. A cytokine is also a growth hormone. The difference between auxins and cytokines is that cytokines generally stimulate cell division, whereas auxins stimulate both cell division and cell elongation and size growth. The third is called a gibberellin, and what separates gibberellins from auxins and cytokines is that they're primarily responsible for the germination of dormant seeds. And so they're secreted when the environmental conditions are correct. They are secreted, and then they stimulate dormant seeds to germinate. The fourth is called abscisic acid, and abscisic acid is probably improperly named because it doesn't cause the abscisic layer to form on the leaves. What it does is it triggers plants in bad conditions to remain dormant. And then the last of these is ethylene, and ethylene is a gas actually that is part of natural gas that actually is responsible for fruit ripening. And ethylene is what's responsible for, if you have one apple that say becomes rotten and you have it in a bag of apples, that rotten apple will secrete ethylene and cause the apples around it to also become rotten. So if you detect a rotten fruit in a bunch of fruits or in a basket, you take it out to prevent the ethylene that's secreted from causing the rest of the fruit to become rotten. Now let's go through several. There are several special stems. These are considered stems, but sometimes are not seen as stems when we first think about them. And the first of these is a bulb. We probably know about bulbs because tulips come from bulbs. And so here's a bulb, and if you plant this bulb and it's designed primarily to store food, then it will grow roots and produce a tulip plant in this case. The second and another example of this is the onion, and here's a group of onion bulbs that are being cultivated to grow more onions. The second of these is called a corm, and a corm is very much like a bulb except it has a thicker stem and thinner leaves above it and more obvious roots. An example of a corm is crocus. Crocus is a flower. And so this is an example of a corm. The third is a rhizome. A rhizome are thick stems that frequently grow underground and usually grow horizontally underground. Roots can come off of them. A nice example of a rhizome is ginger root. I don't know if you've ever been to a Chinese supermarket or a place that sells ginger, but you'll see these. They look like roots, but they're actually, and they're called root. It's called ginger root, but it's actually a stem. Another example is the iris. Another special stem is called a stolon. A stolon, sometimes also called a runner, goes underground or right on the surface, and at some point along the way it can produce a second plant or even a third plant. And you can see from the original plant, you can have several plants radiating out from the original plant. A good example of this is the strawberry. The next is a tendril, and actually we saw some tendrils when we were talking about thigmotropism. Tendrils are stems that wrap around things, and they sense, touch something, and then they sense that, and then they begin to wrap around it. And this is an example of a tendril wrapping around a wire or a clothesline. And grape or Boston ivy, grapevines or Boston ivy are two examples of plants that have tendrils. Another special stem, and not a lot of people realize these are stems. They think they're roots. Is a tuber. And a tuber is not a stem. It's not a root. It's a stem. And the eyes of the potato tuber in this case are nodes on the stem. So these represent nodes, which is why if you put these in water, they will sometimes sprout out from the potato. And as I said, potatoes are an example. These grow underground. So again, many people think these are roots. They are not. They are stems. And then the last special stem we'll talk about is the thorn. And again, a lot of times people don't realize that thorns are special stems. And thorns act as protection. And here's a honey locust tree that has fairly formidable thorns. And their principal objective is to prevent animals from chewing on the bark of the tree.